In Chicago, the 1920s roared louder than any other city, a frantic, desperate sound fueled by illegal spirits and endless ambition. The entire country was thirsty, but Chicago was owned by the man who supplied the alcohol, the man who controlled the police, the man who was everything the American dream promised, twisted into a nightmare. Al Capone. He was the boss. He didn't just sell liquor, he sold power and fear. He commanded respect, and with every bottle illegally poured, his empire grew stronger. From the shadows of speakeasies to the halls of power, Capone was a ghost and a giant, both seen and unseen. He was invincible, he was untouchable, until his eyes landed on the one thing he couldn't acquire with money or force. In the hazy glow of his most exclusive speakeasy, the Four Deuces, amidst the drunken laughter and the scent of expensive cigars, stood Eleanor. She wasn't an actress, a chorus girl, or a moll. She was reserved, elegant, and crucially, unimpressed. Her dress was modest, her eyes clear, a stark contrast to the surrounding decadence. Capone, accustomed to women falling at his feet and men scrambling for his favor, saw a challenge in her quiet defiance. He saw a mirror reflecting his own lack of legitimacy. He saw everything his life of violence had failed to secure: respectability. To win Eleanor, Capone had to prove he wasn't just a criminal. He had to become a king. He had to build a kingdom so grand, so dazzling, that she would have no choice but to be his queen. He needed her to be the symbol that validated his bloody ambition. His empire was about to become his courtship, and the cost would be measured in blood.
The empire as a gift. Capone's beginnings were the streets. Born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrants, he left school early and earned his infamous scar while working for Frankie Yale. He was just a street thug, violent and ambitious, but with a surprising talent for organization. He moved to Chicago under the wing of Johnny Torrio, the city's reigning crime boss. Then came the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. The law was supposed to save America from alcohol. Instead, it delivered the treasury of the United States directly into Capone's hands. He saw the law as an opportunity, transforming cheap grain into liquid gold. Prohibition didn't just outlaw drinking, it funded the mafia. And Capone quickly rose to become its CEO. Capone's network was a logistical marvel, spanning from Canada to Florida. A 1,000-mile pipeline fueled by thirst. He controlled distilleries, breweries, trucking lines, and crucially, the entire political and police apparatus of Chicago. He paid off judges, police chiefs, and politicians, ensuring his competitors were arrested while his barrels flowed freely.
Capone transformed this colossal enterprise into his courtship. He was desperate for Eleanor to see him not as a brute, but as a tycoon. He started a relentless campaign of ostentation. He bought a lavish estate on Palm Island, Florida, a fortress of opulence built for protection, but also built for show. Every silk suit, every diamond watch, every lavish party was tailored for her approval. He spent an estimated $100 million a year on his empire, but the true investment was in his image, an image he hoped Eleanor would accept. He would throw extravagant dinner parties at the Lexington Hotel, demanding the finest musicians and imported delicacies. He ensured Eleanor was seated close to him, watching her reaction to the power he wielded, the deference of the men around him, the hushed awe of the city's elite.
But Eleanor remained an enigma. She accepted the gifts, perhaps out of fear or curiosity, but her eyes held a quiet judgment he couldn't bribe. Capone was used to people bending. Eleanor merely watched. She didn't seek his attention. He had to demand it. This fueled his obsessive need for a grander spectacle, a power display that would make her and the world bow down. Capone used the escalating gang wars not only for business, but as a grotesque proof of affection. The city was a chessboard, and he was the player showing Eleanor his absolute control. His rival, Dion O'Banion, was the main obstacle to full control. When O'Banion was gunned down, it was a bloody, high-profile execution. Capone wanted Eleanor to see the chaos and realize he was the only man capable of protecting her from it. The message was clear. He was life and death in Chicago. But where he expected awe, he found only a deeper reservation. He had convinced her of his brutality, but he had failed to convince her of his worth.
The climax of obsession. By 1929, Capone's obsession and his ego were out of control. His organization was making hundreds of millions, yet he felt profoundly unfulfilled because of one woman's indifference. His need to prove himself transcended business logic. His last major rival in Chicago was George "Bugs" Moran. Moran was an annoyance, but Capone's need for an absolute, unquestionable victory had become paramount. The time for subtlety was over. Capone needed an act so monstrous, so bold, that it would silence all his critics, eliminate his rivals, and settle the score with Eleanor's skepticism once and for all. The decision was made. The plan for the St. Valentine's Day massacre was a masterpiece of cold, calculated terror. Capone's men lured Moran's top associates to a warehouse under the pretense of a cheap liquor deal. On February 14th, 4 of Capone's men, 2 dressed as police officers, stormed the warehouse. They lined up 7 unarmed men against the wall and opened fire with machine guns. It was not a shootout. It was an execution. Capone, with his genius for public relations, had made sure he was in Florida at the time, cultivating a perfect alibi, and perhaps planning a grand unveiling of his triumph for Eleanor upon his return. 7 men executed. The most brutal gang murder in American history. The world gasped. Capone had achieved peak notoriety. The newspapers were saturated with his name. He was the undisputed king of Chicago. But the victory was hollow, and it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The sheer horror of the act did not impress Eleanor. It terrified her. She saw not a glamorous king who could protect her, but a relentless monster whose shadow would eventually consume her. She could no longer mistake the blood on his hands for the silk of his suit. The ultimate rejection. The empire he built to prove his worth was the very thing that drove her away. When Eleanor finally rejected him, permanently withdrawing from his life of luxury and violence, Capone was shattered. He was left with his wealth, his power, and the devastating realization that the cost of his love was a public act of terror that made him the most hunted man in America. The empire he built for her became, in his eyes, useless. The fall and legacy. The massacre was the beginning of the end. Capone, distracted by his obsession and the resulting chaos, became sloppy. While Elliot Ness hunted liquor, the real enemy, the Internal Revenue Service, hunted his finances. Capone had boasted, swaggered, and spent millions to impress. But his ambition blinded him to the basic rule of government: pay your taxes. The man who could not be caught for 1,000 murders fell for mere greed. The irony was poetic. Guilty of tax evasion, a sentence to Alcatraz. Stripped of his suits, his jewelry, his power, Capone, the king of Chicago, became just another number. But the true tragedy unfolded behind the bars. The untreated syphilis, a remnant of his early life, progressed into neurosyphilis, slowly eating away at his mind. The man who commanded Chicago with an iron fist now suffered hallucinations and mental regression. He talked to ghosts, lost his memory, and became a burden to his fellow inmates. He was eventually released from Alcatraz. His mind regressed to that of a 12-year-old child. He lived out his final years confused, chasing imaginary enemies in his luxurious Florida mansion. His story remains a dark, chilling reminder. The only thing more dangerous than a man without a heart is a man who desperately wants one.